This is the Bema Podcast with Marty Solomon. I'm his co-host, Brent Billings. Today we are bringing our study of Torah to a close by exploring the book of Deuteronomy, examining its call to remember our stories. And we're joined by Reed Dent today.
Hello, everybody.
Reed Dent in the house, about ready to leave the house. You're hitting the road.
Yep.
Well, we're recording before he does. We are at the end. Golly, we're at the end of the session 1 reboot. It would feel wrong if we didn't review before the last episode. So we're going to do that. We're going to review big time in the capstone, the next episode that we have coming out. But we're going to review here too, because review is what we do.
That rhymed.
I know. That was very clever.
Good job.
It was very clever on my behalf. We have a preface and an introduction. The book of Genesis basically sets the stage. Genesis will set the stage. Talk about the goodness of creation, invitation to trust. We'll see a family that wrestles with what that means and what it looks like to do that. But then we have this narrative, and this narrative is going to be this story that's always comparing and contrasting empire versus shalom, these two ideas. And God takes his people out of empire, and then he has to get empire out of his people. And part of how he does that is he takes them to Mount Sinai, and they have this big wedding, and he says, if you'll marry me, you're going to be for me a kingdom of priests. And they don't even know what that means. And so we have the book of Leviticus, and God says, this is what priesthood means. And all of this is a part of defining their partnership, defining their relationship together. All this is a part of how they're going to be shaped. All of this is a part of how God gets Egypt, empire, out of his people. And really, we see that in the book of Numbers and what we called the honeymoon in the desert. We went through all these images of desert wandering and wilderness and living water and shade and rotum bushes and acacia trees and tamarisk trees. And we just learned all the stuff that you learn in the desert, this long learning transformative process of living with God and being shaped in the desert. And that brings us to the last and final book of the books of Moses, of Torah. And we're going to do it all in one episode today. So it feels daunting.
Ambitious.
Absolutely. But really, before we even do that, I think, the last episode we talked about Moses striking the rock. Is that we're kind of coming out of the wilderness. We're coming towards the end of Moses's life. We have this conversation about Moses striking the rock. And I always struggled to have that conversation, to wrestle with that episode, because it feels like you really beat up on Moses. And I remember years ago in our first go around, we had a listener email us, Christy did, and she sent us a message, and she said, I always love to remember the epitaph of Moses. So if you don't mind, Brent, read us the very end of Deuteronomy today. And let's start there before we even get into the book. Give me 34, 10 through 12, which I believe is the last closing verses of the book of Deuteronomy.
Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel.
It's a pretty good epitaph. Like if I had some closing verses written about my life, that is pretty good. I remember when Christy shared this with us years ago. I can't remember if it was Ray or if it was George DeYoung, because Christy's gone on trips with both of them. One of the teachers had an illustration that she told us about, which was he had this married couple on his trip. And he had the married couple comes in. He says, I want to talk to you about this phrase face to face means. And he had them stand facing each other, like a foot apart, and just kind of, he says, that's not face to face. He said, I need you to get closer, like close enough you can just kind of reach out and touch each other on the shoulder. So they got a little bit closer. And he says, that's not face to face. And he had them touch foreheads, like put their foreheads against each other, like faces touching. He says, that's not what the Hebrew phrase face to face makes. And then he says, because you're this married couple, I want you to give each other like this marital kiss and embrace. And so this couple embraced as only a marital couple would. And the teacher said that is this idea of the Hebrew phrase face to face, this intimate relationship that Moses had with God. I don't want to get weird or stupid with that, but it conveys a certain level of intimacy. I can't remember if this is a phrase from Christy or if it's something I said in the original episode. I'm just not sure Moses cared that he didn't get to make it into the promised land. I'm just not sure. I'm not sure he cared. Actually, Reed, as we record this, we're in the process of writing a book together, and you have a chapter on this, and you kind of say basically that, didn't you?
Yeah, the death of Moses, the not making it into the promised land is just one of the most interesting things to me, and that's why we have like a whole chapter on this one story.
Yeah.
Which my observation is just, and to keep it short, I do think that Moses gets an unfair bad rap because people focus on, oh, well, he disobeyed and he didn't make it in. And that's not even getting into the weeds. I mean, you mentioned striking the rock. Well, it's these parallel stories of strike it, and then he gets in trouble for striking it later because he was told to speak to it. And there's just a whole bunch there that is way more complex than we give it credit for. But then at the end of the day, you know, when Moses, when he goes up on Mount Nebo to die, the phrase is that he died there by usually gets translated by the word of the Lord, but really could be translated by the mouth of the Lord. And there's a great midrash, this very moving midrash, where the rabbis envision it as a kiss.
Yeah.
And that is how God kind of ushers Moses into his death. And it also envisions all of creation, heaven and earth, weeping along with God as God ushers Moses into his death and then wraps like the earth around him for sort of like a tomb. And it's this beautiful, sad picture. But I think if we ask what counts as success, is it just getting to the promised land?
Right.
Just to this patch of earth? Or is it walking with God in such a way as there is this kind of intimate love, even in his passing? So yeah, there's way more there, and I guess I will just tell people, look out for the book when it comes.
Absolutely. And that really is it. Like, in light of all the other things that Moses knew about God and the way he knew God, I'm just not sure that Moses probably looks at this argument and was like, but guys, who cared? Like, I was buried by God himself. I knew him face to face. So many much, and I love your connection to success there. So, all right, let's talk about Deuteronomy. We're already here. Deuteronomy is essentially this closing teaching of Moses. Like, what is it really as far as textual criticism? We could have that conversation. But traditionally, it's presented kind of like this closing teaching is how it's often perceived. This second giving of the law. It is a call to remember our story, a call to remember where we've come from. And so in today's episode, I just want to look at all these references. There are two references that pop out of Deuteronomy. There are 14 references to the term to the word remember. The word for remember here in Deuteronomy is zachar. And zachar has 14 references. And there's another phrase we're going to look at here in a moment. That is, do not forget. And we'll look at that Hebrew word, the word for forget and not forgetting, and the word for remembering. So let's look at these like 14 references to the word zachar. And Brent, let's just hear these one after another. You have one in Deuteronomy 5?
Yeah, verse 15. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day.
Okay, so in this regard, this is a phrase we'll want to remember over and over again. Remember that you are slaves in Egypt. Like, very directly, God is wanting his people to remember their story, to remember where they came from, to remember where their story begins. In this case, connected to Sabbath, but this idea of remember that you were slaves in Egypt, that is why I command you to do this, is going to show up repeatedly. How about Deuteronomy 7, Brent?
But do not be afraid of them. Remember well what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all Egypt.
You need to remember what God did to your enemies. What about Deuteronomy 8?
Two references. We have, remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. And then a few verses later, but remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth and so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your ancestors as it is today.
All right. We're going to see later 3 references of do not forget show up. So that's going to be 5 references in chapter 8. Chapter 8 in Deuteronomy is the big theme is remember, do not forget, remember, do not forget. How about Deuteronomy 9, Brent?
2 references again. Remember this and never forget how you aroused the anger of the Lord your God in the wilderness. From the day you left Egypt until you arrived here, you have been rebellious against the Lord. And then later on, remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Overlook the stubbornness of this people, their wickedness, and their sin.
This is showing up. This is a theme in Deuteronomy. Like, we're doing this on purpose. Like, I know that, but chapter 5, chapter 7, twice in chapter 8, twice in chapter 9. we get a little break all the way to chapter 15 before we hear it again. But go ahead and give me chapter 15.
Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That is why I give you this command today.
All right, there's that same idea, that repeated phrase. By the way, you could also see this in books like Leviticus. It's not just Deuteronomy, but this constant theme of the reason that God's asking you to be who you are now is because of who you used to be then. You remember what it's like to be there, so now I want you to live here and in this way. How about Deuteronomy 16?
2 references again. Do not eat it with bread made with yeast, but for 7 days eat unleavened bread, the bread of affliction, because you left Egypt in haste, so that all the days of your life you may remember the time of your departure from Egypt. And then later on, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and follow carefully these decrees.
Okay, so our festivals and our holidays and our celebrations and our parties are connected to this idea of remembering, reminding ourselves and remembering where we came from. What about Deuteronomy 24? You got anything in there?
3 of them in this chapter.
Ooh, big one.
Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam along the way after you came out of Egypt. And then remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. That is why I command you to do this. And then just a couple of verses later, remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this.
Pretty consistent, constant idea. I think the very next chapter is going to have another reference, chapter 25.
Remember what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt.
All right, so we'll talk a little bit more about that with the next word. Then there's a song at the end of Deuteronomy, like this song they're supposed to memorize and sing every single year and recite to one another, and that has a reference to remember. Give me Deuteronomy 32.
Remember the days of old. Consider the generations long past. Ask your father, and he will tell you, your elders, and they will explain to you.
All right, so now this idea of remembering isn't just an internal thing like you remember in your mind individually. This is a remembering that we do together. This is a remembering where I ask my elders, and I ask my parents, and I ask my grandparents, and the remembering process is now connected to my relationships. This idea of remembering runs throughout Deuteronomy. And in case the word remember wasn't enough, we also have the word for do not forget. The word for do not forget is the word shakach. Shakach, to forget. And we are told not to forget. 9 references in Deuteronomy to do not forget. We'll give Brent a break here. Reed, do you want to read us some Deuteronomy? How about chapter 4?
Only be careful and watch yourselves closely so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen or let them fade from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to their children after them.
You got anything else in chapter 4?
Yeah, I got another one. Be careful not to forget the covenant of the Lord your God that he made with you. Do not make for yourselves an idol in the form of anything the Lord your God has forbidden.
You got anything else in chapter 4?
There is another one. This one is actually about God not forgetting.
Oh, so even God remembers. Go ahead and give it to us anyway for funsies.
For the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not abandon or destroy you or forget the covenant with your ancestors, which he confirmed to them by oath.
Oh, that's like an extra credit one we got to throw in there. God doesn't forget either. I like that. Okay. What about Deuteronomy 6?
Be careful that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery.
This really runs very parallel to remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and this one, do not forget that you were slaves. Like, this is a constant theme. Like, the word remember would have been enough, but there's even more if we widen out our search here. What about Deuteronomy 8?
Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I am giving you this day. And then a couple of verses later, then your heart will become proud and you will forget the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So that one's kind of a warning about what might happen.
Yes.
And then another one in chapter 8. If you ever forget the Lord your God and follow other gods and worship and bow down to them, I testify against you today that you will surely be destroyed.
Okay. This word's going to not show up for a little bit of time. It pops back in there in Deuteronomy 25, right?
When the Lord your God gives you rest from all the enemies around you in the land he is giving you to possess as an inheritance, you shall blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget.
Yeah, that was that. It's always a weird reference to like read without addressing, but that reference to Amalek, if you read that passage in Deuteronomy 25, God's saying Amalek attacked the weak and the sick and the slow. Like Amalek purposely found people wandering through the desert. They were a band of desert raiders, Deuteronomy says, that attacked from behind, and they purposely attacked the weak and the helpless. And God says, I hate that. I hate violence anyway, but that they would double down on a really sick version of violence. I want you to never forget that, and I want their name gone as God says it in Deuteronomy. So that's the context to that reference there. But how about Deuteronomy 26?
Then say to the Lord your God, I have removed from my house the sacred portion, and have given it to the Levite, the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, according to all you commanded. I have not turned aside from your commands, nor have I forgotten any of them.
Nor have I forgotten any of them. We touched on something else we're going to hit on here in a moment. But what about Deuteronomy 31?
And when many disasters and calamities come on them, this song will testify against them, because it will not be forgotten by their descendants.
So it's referencing the song that was in 32, and it's telling you this song is given so that we will not forget. We're not going to forget because this song exists. So then we get to this song, and we already heard the word remember show up, but you have a reference to forget here in the song itself, Deuteronomy 32.
You deserted the rock who fathered you. You forgot the God who gave you birth.
This is our theme in Deuteronomy. Do not forget, remember. Remember where you came from. And we did this on purpose so we could really feel the repetition and the weight of these words just keep coming up. It showed up in Deuteronomy 4 3 times, Deuteronomy 5, 6, 7, 8 3 times, actually 5 times, Deuteronomy 9 twice, Deuteronomy 15, 16 twice, 24 3 times, 25, 26, 31 and 32 twice. Like this word shows up almost in every chapter of Deuteronomy. Not quite, but many of them. This is a big deal. This idea, probably your first slide in your presentation actually has some kind of concluding thoughts here. We are to remember where we came from. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. Usually God is going to connect this with the idea of the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow. The old NIV used to say the alien, the orphan, and the widow. So our students used to get used to this shorthand. They call it the AOW. The AOW, the Bema students. The AOW, the alien, the orphan, and the widow. These groups of people that we're supposed to remember. I kind of like the term foreigner, orphan, and widow a little better these days in the newer translation. But the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow. Remember that you were foreigners in Egypt. Remember that you were orphans. Literally, spiritually. Remember that you were widows. Remember where you came from. Remember that you were foreigners. Remember that you were orphans. Remember that you were widows. We were those people, the foreigners, the orphans, and the widows. When we remember that we were these people, we notice them. Like when I remember that I was a foreigner and I was an orphan and I was a widow, I see the foreigners, the orphans, and the widows. When I remember who I was, I see who they are now. And when I see them and when I serve them and when I minister to them and when they're in my life, they minister to me because they remind me of who I was. It's this circular thing. When I remember, I see them. And when I see them, I remember. And this is why God wants us in these close relationships. He doesn't want us to push these groups to the margins. He doesn't want us to put these groups out of our eyesight so we can put our blinders on and forget, because they remind us of who we are, who we've been. And when we remember who we are and who we've been, we see them and we care for them and we bring them in. We do the things that God wanted us to do. We have to be people that remember where we came from. Like imagine a world, and I said this, by the way, in 2016. You can go back and listen to the Legacy episode. This is not some current events commentary from Marty Solomon on the Bema podcast. I said this in 2016. Can you imagine a world, like a country that was built on the fact that we are migrants and immigrants, that forget the story of where we've come from? And we forget that, and we forget our call, and we start to treat a particular group of people. Like imagine a biblical lesson that may be more relevant. Let's look at this, shall we?
I'll just back you up a little bit more, Marty. It wasn't even 2016.
It wasn't. Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
It was your first class. Like this had nothing to do with anybody you might be thinking of right now. This was such a long time ago.
Yeah, this was 2011. Yeah, absolutely. When we started, this curriculum goes way back. I got the proof. I've got the black market Bema behind under the table episodes recorded on a hard drive somewhere. Like I can prove it if I have to. This isn't some political commentary. This is what the Bible invited God's people to remember and invited God's people to be. Remember where you come from. Because if you ever forget where you came from, you will stop being the kind of people that I wanted you to be. So let's hear some of these verses about the foreigner, the orphan and the widow. How are we to treat these foreigners and orphans and widows? Brent, give me Deuteronomy 10:18.
He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing.
So a reminder of how God feels about the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow. How about Deuteronomy 14:28 through 29?
At the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns, so that the Levites, who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied, and so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands.
So in the very practices, traditions, social infrastructure, socio-political realities that they have built, that they live in this land, you have these systems and these practices that are supposed to benefit the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow. You're supposed to do things a particular way. So what's the context of that verse, Brent? What's being talked about there?
It's first fruits and tithes.
Yeah, so this is where we take a portion, a tenth, a tithe of what we have, and these are to be used in a particular way. One of the ways we use them is for the alien, the orphan, the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow. What about Deuteronomy 16?
I got a couple instances here. Rejoice before the Lord your God at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name. You, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, the Levites in your towns, and the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows living among you.
So in that reference, they're not outsiders. They are a part of this larger community, they're not somebody they're included. They're completely included. Okay, what about your next reference you said in Deuteronomy 16?
Be joyful at your festival, you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levites, the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns.
So present at our parties, it's talking about festivals there. So present at our parties, present at our festivals, present at our celebrations are supposed to be the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow. Like we're all supposed to celebrate Sabbath, rest, together, like everyone's supposed to be included in that. Fascinating. How about Deuteronomy 24?
Got a big chunk here at the end of the chapter. Do not deprive the foreigner or the fatherless of justice, or take the cloak of the widow as a pledge. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. That is why I command you to do this. When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this.
But Reed, it's not their olive trees. It's not they didn't do all the work to grow all those olives, to grow all that wheat, to produce all those grapes. And yet I'm supposed to leave some of the grapes and leave some of the figs and leave some of the wheat and leave some of the olives. What is this?
Isn't it amazing? I mean, it really, when you take it in, I love this is like a fire hose of these verses.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, rival conceptions of God in the ancient world, right? And like tribalism and all the kind of things that you can caricature like that world as. And here, just time and time and time again, it is take care of people that really are actually going to weigh you down. They're going to slow you down. They're going to make you weaker. They're a potential threat. If they're a foreigner, like, how do you know that they're not a spy or something like that, you know? And it just really is incredible how open, how inclusive that the message of God has been since the very beginning. I mean, it just really is. It's what can you say other than it's just such a beautiful thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Good thing that we've had long enough that we've gotten the message by now. And
absolutely.
That we're really good at this.
We are so evolved as a people. I do love that.
Well, and it's not like they were blind to the idea of spies. Like they sent spies of their own into the promised land.
Sure. Yep.
But that was still their call.
Yep. What about Deuteronomy 25, Brent? I like this one.
If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. Then a little while later, however, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. he will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me. Then the elders of his town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, I do not want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, This is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled.
The family of the unsandaled. That's got to be a rough moniker to carry around. But notice here, and there's a whole discussion here about Levirate marriage, which we're not going to get into. It's beyond the scope of what we're trying to do right here. The point being here is that you're finding the widows in this patriarchal, patrilineal culture. Do not let them be tossed aside. Make sure they're taken care of. The whole community here is coming together to make sure we do the right thing. I put it this way, I think, in the last episode, the first time around. Woe to a culture that would find people groups that are unproductive and sweep them away to the margins. You make sure you do what's necessary. The whole practice of Levirate marriage. Make sure you restore dignity. Make sure you restore honor to a name. Make sure you take care of a widow and that she's provided for. Do not push these marginal groups to the fringes. Make sure they are brought inside. We talked in the Book of Numbers study in the images of the desert. Circle the wagons. You know whether or not it's a community of shalom or a community of empire based on where you find the weak. So where will you find the widows and the foreigners and the orphans? They will be inside the community, which has come around them to make sure they're taken care of. We got a couple more references. How about Deuteronomy 26?
When you have finished setting aside a tenth of all your produce in the 3rd year, the year of the tithe, you shall give it to the Levite, the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that they may eat in your towns and be satisfied. Then say to the Lord your God, I have removed from my house the sacred portion and have given it to the Levite, the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, according to all you commanded. I have not turned aside from your commands, nor have I forgotten any of them.
All right, this 3rd year tithe was collected in your village, in your town, in your city gate, and then was redistributed to those who would have needs, like the foreigner and the orphan and the widow. How about Deuteronomy 27?
Cursed is anyone who withholds justice from the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow. Then all the people shall say, Amen.
Pretty good. Now, Reed, I got a question for you. And this isn't I'm not trying to throw a bunch of shade or rip on, I was raised by people who followed Jesus passionately. They did a great job teaching me about Jesus, and I owe my faith to the people that discipled me, raised me, baptized me, led me. But I was not taught about this at all growing up. What would you say that's the same for you?
Yeah, I mean, I was taught about how to get to heaven. I was taught about, salvation and just mercy and grace, and in a sort of, for me, as the sinner. And then the idea, it was very much about, that. And then this kind of stuff, when I finally encountered it, I don't know, sometime in college or through what I was reading, it felt like there was a pendulum swing almost where it was like, well, no, this is all, and we talked about this before, right? Where it's like, no, this is all that matters. And I think the Bible wants to hold all of these things together. But for me, yeah, it was, as I suspect for a lot of people, this was the thing that was, de-emphasized to say the least, and probably just kind of passed over altogether.
Totally, absolutely. So I have always loved this closing study of Torah and what it tries to remind me of, and how it brings some things to the center that had been decentered for me in my upbringing. I want to close with one more way to look at Deuteronomy. That was very poetic. It kind of has a prophetic tone to it. But let's close with a little bit of maybe textual criticism. Literary criticism, we might say. We have, again, that presentation that's in your notes. We have these closing slides here, and I wanted to talk about Deuteronomy as covenant. One of the places you can read about this, by the way, Epic of Eden by Sandra Richter. Excellent source. I think we've even referenced it already, at least more than once in session 1. But she does a good job of talking about covenants, and she talks about covenants in very, 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 very similar ways to what my teachers taught me about covenants. Covenants in the ancient world, we've talked about before. Brent or Reed, if you can remember and want to play, can you remember the kinds of covenant, at least one of the major covenants we talked about in session 1?
That would be the suzerain vassal.
The suzerain vassal covenant. He gets it. So we have these suzerain vassal covenants, and they often follow a very similar format, kind of 5 parts that more than one scholar, Sandra Richter, John Walton, my teacher, Ray Vanderlaan, on his website. You can find articles. In fact, maybe even we can get one of those from his site, and Brent can put it in the show notes as well. But they have these 5 sections of these covenants. There's a preamble, some kind of introductory setup. There's a historical summary. It kind of tells the story of how the two parties, how did the suzerain and the vassal get to where they're at? How did they come together? Where did they meet? All that kind of stuff. And then you have a section on the demands, the rules, the laws, whatever those stipulations might be. There's a section of stipulations, laws. Then there's a section that's going to be a reward and punishment section. There's rewards for obedience and punishments for disobedience. And this section is almost always the same. There is a small little list of rewards because remember, the suzerain vassal is a power imbalance covenant. The suzerain has all the power. Like that's how the covenant works. The suzerain is holding the vassal under the weight of this relationship and this arrangement. So there's usually a very short section on rewards. If you do what you're told, things go well for you. Now, if you don't do what you're told, the punishment section is usually huge and long and hyperbolic. It is, let me tell you all the things I'm going to do to you if you disobey me. Because the covenant's written by the suzerain, not the vassal. So the suzerain's telling. So that is usually the way the covenant works. Rewards and punishments, light on reward, very heavy, sickeningly heavy on punishment. And then usually there's a conclusion. Oftentimes the conclusion will be a poem, a song, some way that, because they don't have a printing press. So you got to remember this covenant. So usually there's some kind of summary put to song that everybody can remember so that they can remember the covenant. That's often how these covenants are set up. And you may already realize where we're headed. And the next slide there, we have Deuteronomy. And you might notice that Deuteronomy in a lot of ways follows this outline. You have a preamble. We might say first half of chapter 1, 1a. And then the second half of chapter 1 into chapter 4, we could talk about the historical. It's telling the story. There's our historical summary. The bulk of Deuteronomy, chapters 5 through 26. And you could chop this up in different ways if you wanted to. But 5 through 26 would be the demands, the rules, the laws, the law code, the legal code. Chapter 28 is rewards and punishments. Reed, you ever remember anything about Deuteronomy 28 and how that feels when you're reading Deuteronomy 28? You ever swam in those waters?
Yes. I mean, the punishments
light on reward and heavy on punishment.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I was thinking of some of the punishments that it's like, that sounds. I'll obey.
Yeah, seriously. But that fits the genre.
Yeah, totally.
Of what they're used to, right? They would be like, oh yeah, this is totally normal. In fact, some scholars have even said, actually, it's really heavy on punishment, but it's actually, when you compare it to the other covenants that they're used to, it's actually still quite humane. It's more God saying, if you don't do this, it's not going to work for you. It's not God saying, let me tell you how I'm just going to make you suffer. But God saying, yeah, if you don't do this, life is not going to go well for you. Then there's a conclusion with the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32, which is, by the way, this brilliant teaching. Rabbi Foreman has this great teaching. We'll hyperlink in the show notes. But Rabbi Foreman has this great teaching about the Song of Moses, because the Song of Moses, it's kind of this depressing song. Like you're thinking it's the end of Deuteronomy. Moses is about ready to die. Like, let the music swell and we'll all have this touching moment with Moses at the end. And the Song of Moses is like, you're going to fail. You're going to fail. You're going to realize that you're failing. And then you're going to fail some more because God will like forsake you and let you go your way. And Rabbi Foreman has this brilliant teaching of the Song of Moses. No, it's not a song of great celebration. It's a song of Moses saying you're going to fail. But Rabbi Foreman shows it's also a song showing you how you can make your way back. Like you're going to find your way back. You're going to find your way back the hard way, but the real sustainable way. And so that you'll find that there in the links. But I always love to point out Torah itself is shaped this way. Some people have noted the 5 books of Moses feel like a covenant. Like the preamble, book of Genesis. Historical summary of how we got here, story of Exodus. Demands, rules, and laws, book of Leviticus. How about the rewards and punishments? Heavy on the punishments. How about the book of Numbers? And then the conclusion, this kind of rewrap, this song almost, book of Deuteronomy. And that seems to fit a lot too. So anyway, that's a great way to just kind of summarize from a literary perspective, just how you can look at Deuteronomy and Torah as a whole as we wrap up session 1. So that's what we got there. But Brent, what are you thinking? Reed, what do you got?
Well, I actually went and I looked at, just kind of did some looking online for some comparable of these texts, of these other, sort of vassal treaties and stuff like that. And it is kind of interesting to see the parallels, and Elle could speak to this way more than I could, but even some of the words themselves that make their way into the Hebrew seem to be related to, other like the Akkadian and whatever that comes. And so this is way out of my depth, but it's interesting to see that the Israelites seem to be aware of the world that they lived in, and just that what gets replaced is this, where before its loyalty is kind of sworn to a king, and the king is the one who is said to have saved them and, sort of been gracious to them. All of that is replaced with what we're looking for is loyalty to God. This is ultimately who we are accountable to. And it just seems like a very, a very thing of the people, and we know who is running the show ultimately, and there's not going to be one person who's going to direct us. And then you hold that intention with the way that Moses is viewed, That's really my only thought, is that it's very theologically minded. Like if we're doing comparative literature, like this is suzerain vassal, but it's very God, Moses is not the one who's put in there as the guy, which is maybe what you would expect if you were just doing a straight comparison to some of these other suzerain vassal and those kind of covenants.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Foreman will go to some great lengths to make that point about how Moses is not the stand-in. Foreman connects this to our last episode with Striking the Rock. And he says Moses is trying to stand in as this demigod figure. Not intentionally, he's not trying to blow him, but he thinks he's got to do this thing that God's like, no, I'm going to do that thing. I will be that thing for the people. Don't do my job for me. And you feel that. I love you bringing that up in Deuteronomy. Absolutely.
Well, I have a little passage from Deuteronomy 32 that I feel like is a good close.
Well, beautiful. We need a good close. My notes are empty, Brent.
Well, I think this really speaks to what's going on here. It starts off when Moses finished reciting all these words to all Israel. Now, the question is, what are all these words? Is it just talking about the song
that
he just went through in Deuteronomy 32? Is it talking about Deuteronomy as a whole? Is it talking about Torah as a whole?
Yep.
And I think there's a pretty good argument that this is about Torah. But it says, when Moses finished reciting all these words to all Israel, he said to them, "Take to heart all the words I have solemnly declared to you this day, so that you may command your children to obey carefully all the words of this law. They are not just idle words for you. They are your life. By them you will live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to possess."
Absolutely.
That's how seriously these words are taken.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
This is where the line comes from, right? I put before you this day life and death. And the choice seems to be, you can follow these precepts, you can follow these words, and that is life. It's like there's a distinction between, it doesn't just lead to life like as a reward, an arbitrary reward for following it. But if you live in this way, this is the way that brings about the kind of life that God intends, like just as its natural sort of outworking.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we would say the way that's going to be connected to our ability to remember our story, our ability to connect our present to our past, our ability to not forget who God is or who we are or where we've come from or what God's doing. And when we remember that, apparently we're going to see a bunch of other people that have been where we have been. We're going to notice foreigners and orphans and widows. We're going to take care of folks on the margins. And somehow in the midst of all of this, in the midst of that remembering and in the midst of this practice, we find life. Life is in the midst of all of this stuff.
This is just, shout out for spiritual practice and for storytelling, because remember is like an active thing that you do. Like you have to set yourself to remembering. Maybe I wonder sometimes that we think of it as a very passive sort of like it comes through your mind and goes out. But like the work of actually remembering your own life's story and the things that have happened to you, and then the work of listening through those experiences for what God is wanting to say to you or where God is taking you through those, like that doesn't just happen passively or automatically. And if we don't remove ourselves from the noise of absolutely everything that happens in, around us all the time, and set ourselves some space to actively remember, it's not just going to happen on its own. And so my encouragement to anybody listening is to actually make remembering a spiritual discipline. Buechner, our guy, he calls it listen to your life. make that an active pursuit in your day, in your week, and see maybe that will lead to not only just a deeper intimacy with God, but actually help you in your faithfulness and being faithful to whatever it is that God has put in front of you.
You say that, and one of my favorite practices about your campus ministry that I've ever seen, and it adds a fun element to this, but you guys have this practice you'll do in meetings or gatherings where you'll say, remember that time when? Because the thing about campus ministry, you always have a new group of students every 4 years. And so even more so to what you were saying, you have to actively tell the stories or the stories are all forgotten. And so I've been in meeting rooms on your guys' campus before where you guys have said, hey, remember that time when? And you point to somebody and they're like, oh, yeah, that time. They tell their favorite story. And what a beautiful way of remembering where we've come from and keeping culture alive.
And many times I will hear somebody say, they'll be talking about some alum from years ago, and I don't know that person, but I've heard about them.
Yeah, exactly. 100%. Well, Brent, we still have a capstone, but that's a pretty good way to wrap up session 1, so should take us on out of here.
All right, you can find the presentation and all the other links and other things that we talked about today in the show notes. Check that in your podcast app or on the website, BehemothDiscipleship.com. You can use that website to get in touch with us. You can find out all of our current events, everything that's going on, find a group. If you made it this far and you're not into a group yet, I think it's time to get in one, right? This stuff is, we just talked about it, like remembering together, like doing this stuff out loud, sharing with the people who follow you, asking the people who came before you, like this stuff is better in groups. So if that is at all possible, we encourage you to check that out. We will dump as many resources as we can on you to help you get started. But everything there is on the website. So thanks for joining us on the Bema podcast. We'll talk to you again soon.
Hi, I'm Tanya Williamson, a Bema listener and group facilitator in Gresham, Oregon. And here is the prayer from episode 31's companion. Our Father in heaven, let your words fall like new rain, watering the creation we walk and work, reminding us of your ways so that we may never forget where we came from. May we remember our own time in the desert, that we may embrace the foreigner, orphan, and widow, inviting them into our own Sabbaths and celebrations. As we look forward, may we also look back, never forgetting where you have brought us from and led us to. May we take all your words to heart, for they are not idle, but active, bringing us to life. As you water the earth, may you continue to water our souls and make this so. Amen.